Good evening. I'm Stewart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. Welcome. I want to say a word or two about our speaker's book. Something I've come to admire and even require, and stuff that I'm going to spend a whole bunch of time reading or even listening to, is density. I want a lot of insight, a lot of news, a lot of meat per paragraph in a book. And that's relatively uncommon. But this is about a third of the way through Enlightenment now. You can see I've dog-eared just about every page. And that's because the density of insight and originality and serious news is that thick in this book. And what we'll hear tonight is not the book. The book has a whole lot more than what Steve can say in the course of an hour in a half-hour conversation. So let me introduce the speaker to the introduction to Enlightenment Now. Stephen Pinker.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much. What an honor it is to be speaking at the Long Now and to be introduced by Stewart Brand. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with woe? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, there are some people with confident answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everybody obeys His laws, the world will be perfect. For example, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. In the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony. Until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration, we must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe in, but what do we believe in? In Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the 18th century Enlightenment. In a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they faded into the background as a bland status quo or the establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals too need a positive defense and an explicit commitment. And that's what I've tried to do in Enlightenment Now. The Enlightenment ideals, I suggest, revolve around four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. And let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, and with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you insist that you are right, that other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. Cognitive scientists have shown that we are liable to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible and that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment theme was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Science, moreover, provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The laws of the universe have no goal or purpose related to human welfare, which means that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. And that's because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not for well-being. As Immanuel Kant put it, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. The third Enlightenment value is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Well, human flourishing, who could be against that? Well, in fact, there are alternatives to humanism. It is by no means a trite or banal moral commitment. For example, among the alternatives are that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of artistic or martial or heroic greatness, to advance a mystical force, a dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, an ability to show concern for the welfare of others, another recurring Enlightenment theme. Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, our friends, our allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of ideas and people, such as education, journalism, mobility, art, and reason. As soon as I enter into a conversation with you, I can't insist that my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, this leads to the Enlightenment ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Well, you may ask, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress even be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is through benign institutions that allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to combat entropy, that magnify the better angels of our nature, like reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. Examples of institutions that were brainchildren of the Enlightenment that we continue to enjoy are democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, academies, scientific societies, free press, lecture series, and others. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have found that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. It's not that they hate the fruits of progress, mind you. Most members of the clerisy would still rather have their surgery with anesthesia rather than without it. It's the idea of progress that rankles the chattering class. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, Pangloss, as it turns out, was a pessimist. A true optimist believes there can be much better worlds than the ones we have today. But this is all irrelevant because the question of whether there has been progress is not a matter of seeing the world through rose-colored glasses or having a sunny disposition or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure. If they have increased over time, I submit that is progress. So let's look at the data. Beginning with life, the most precious resource of all. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, with the discovery of vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy across the world has increased so that today it is 71 years. And virtually no one guesses that it's that high. As with many examples of human progress, the development has been highly uneven across the regions of the world. Europe was the first region to escape early death, followed by the Americas. In the 20th century, Asia has shown spectacular increases, and most recently, Africa has begun to close the gap. The life expectancy in Europe is greater than 80 years, but in all regions of the world, life expectancy at birth is increasing. Indeed, in Kenya, life expectancy has increased by 10 years in the last 10 years, which means that for a Kenyan citizen, every year he would get a year older but not approach death at all. Child mortality. For most of human history, the greatest reducer of life expectancy was death in fragile children. Even in Sweden, which today we think of as one of the world's most advanced countries, in 1750, 1/3 of Swedish children did not make it to their 5th birthday. That was reduced to 1/3 of a percentage point. That is a 100-fold decrease. Again, other regions of the world got a later start, but followed the same trajectory. Here we have Canada in North America, South Korea in Asia, Chile in Latin America, and Ethiopia in sub-Saharan Africa, which has reduced its rate of child mortality from 25% to 6%. Still too high, but the progress is continuing. In the 18th century, 1% of Swedish women died in childbirth. That has been brought down by a factor of 250 to 0.004%. And a similar progress was then experienced in the United States, in Malaysia, and here we have Ethiopia. Health. For the greatest proximate cause of death for most of human history was infectious disease. That is largely eliminated as a cause of death in the developed world. In the developing world, it is still a major killer, but tremendous progress has been made there. Just in the last 20 years, the rate of childhood deaths from the 5 most deadly infectious diseases has all been in decline: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to sustain an active adult male on average, and it was only with the British agricultural revolution in the second half of the 18th century that the first country was able to exceed that measure, thanks to advances in agronomy like crop rotation, later to the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, and networks of transportation. Every region of the world has developed the ability to feed itself. Here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, this would be a dubious form of progress if all those extra calories were just making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have greatly reduced the rate of undernourishment. In 1970, about 35% of the developing world was undernourished. That has been cut down to less than 15%. Again, the spread of that progress has been uneven. Latin America was the first region in the developing world to decimate undernourishment. Here you have 3 regions in Asia, and here is progress in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, thanks to the availability of calories, famine, which was one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, which could strike any continent and cause sudden devastation, has been reduced, and famines today are found mainly in war-torn and remote regions. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth. This graph shows the gross world product from the year 1 to the year 2015. And as you can see, not much happened until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and there's been a 200-fold increase in gross world product since the early 18th century. Again, the progress has been highly uneven. The UK was the first country to make what Angus Deaton calls the Great Escape from universal wretchedness and poverty. The United States quickly exceeded it. Here we have South Korea and Asia. Chile and China and India are now showing exponential growth. The GDP per capita in India today is about what Sweden had in 1920. Once again, this would be a dubious example of progress if all of the gains went to the 1% richest, but in fact they have drastically brought down the rate of extreme poverty. $1.90 per person per day in 2015 dollars, the bare minimum necessary to feed one's family. By that definition, about 90% of the world's population was extremely poor 200 years ago. That has been brought down to less than 10%. There's been a 75% reduction in the rate of extreme poverty just since 1999. Because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer, the index of international inequality, that is inequality between countries, has started to decrease. It necessarily increased during the Industrial Revolution when some countries broke away from the pack of universal poverty, but now more recently the tide has begun to turn. Now, within rich countries, of course, inequality has increased, but that does not mean that developed countries have turned their backs on the poor in recent years. Quite the contrary. For hundreds of years, no European or developed country spent more than 1.5% of its GDP on redistribution to the poor, the aged, children, the sick. But in the course of the 20th century, every developed country embarked on a massive program of redistribution, so that today the median among OECD countries in social transfers is 22%. Thanks largely to these transfers, the rate of poverty in the United States has decreased, even as inequality has increased. In 1960, the poverty rate, when it's calculated as disposable income, that is after taxes and transfers, was 32%. That has fallen to 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, it's gone from 30% to less than 3%. Peace. For most of human history, war was the natural state of relations between countries, and peace was a mere interlude between wars. You can see this in this graph, which plots the percentage of years that the great powers of the day, the 800-pound gorillas, the empires and states that could project military force beyond their borders, were at war with each other. In the 1500s and 1600s, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are virtually never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China 65 years ago. If we zoom in on the 20th century, then of course, two of the wars that did occur were horrific bloodbaths. But thanks to, after the Second World War, thanks to expanding economies, denser commercial relations between countries, and norms against conquest and the changing of borders by force, the rate of death in wars of all kinds has skittered downwards. There were peaks for the Korean War. the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and most recently the Syrian Civil War. But the rate has come down from 22 per 100,000 per year in the late 40s and early 50s to about 9 during the Vietnam era, to about 5 during the Iran-Iraq War, to 1.2 today. Freedom and rights. There has been recently conspicuous backsliding in democracy in countries like Russia and Turkey and Venezuela. But still, the overall trend in governance has been towards democracy, as this graph showing the relative democracy versus autocracy score across the world shows. That even with the backsliding in democracy of recent years, the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. And lest that strike you as incredible, keep in mind that in 200 years ago, the number of democracies in the world could be counted on one hand and embraced 1% of the world's population. As recently as the early 1970s, the world only had 31 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and under the control of communist totalitarian dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of the colonels, a military junta. Almost all of Latin America was under the control of military governments. Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, all military governments, and all of them today are democracies. There were about 52 democracies, 52 democracies in 1989. 87 in 2009, the first year of the Obama presidency, when by the time Obama left office, there were 103 democracies in the world, comprising 56% of the world's population. Also, the power of governments to brutalize their citizens is being curtailed. Capital punishment used to be pretty much ubiquitous across countries, and it was applied to trivial misdemeanors like shoplifting and poaching, often in grisly public torture executions like disembowelment and burning at the stake. But beginning with the Enlightenment and swelling to a flood in the 20th century, country after country has abolished the death penalty. If current trends continue, the death penalty will vanish from the earth by 2026. Also, more and more countries have decriminalized homosexuality. Again, there has been backsliding in Russia and several African countries, but overwhelmingly the trend is towards decriminalization. Child labor. In 1850, 30% of English children were sent to work in farms and factories. With the growth of affluence, a premium that modern economies put on education, and in general, a valuation of the lives of children, the rate of child labor has plunged in England and the United States, even more dramatically in Italy, and it's come down in the world as a whole, an accomplishment for which Kailash Satyarthi won the Nobel Peace Prize 3 years ago. Violent crime. Pretty much any region of the world in a state of anarchy suffers from high rates of interpersonal violence. Records for homicide go back in Europe some almost 800 years. And in 1300, in Western European countries had a homicide rate of about 35 per 100,000 per year. With the consolidation of centralized states and kingdoms across the medieval patchwork of baronies and fiefs, the rate of homicide came down in England and the Netherlands from 35 to 1, a similar reduction in Italy, and pretty much any part of the world in which frontier regions come under the control of the rule of law will see a transition from high rates of violence to relatively low ones. As the code of vendetta and a culture of honor is replaced by a court system and the rule of law. It happened later in colonial New England. It happened in the American Wild West when the sheriffs came to town. And even countries that remain notorious for their high rates of violence, such as Mexico, have seen a 5-fold decline of violence from what it was 70 or 80 years ago. If we zoom in on the last 50 years, we see that the United States, which, as with many measures of human flourishing, is something of an outlier among Western democracies. We punch below our wealth in measures of human well-being. And in the United States and in other Western countries, there was something of a crime boom in the 1960s. But starting in 1992, the United States brought its rate of homicide down by more than half. And the world as a whole has reduced its homicide rate by about 30% just in the last 20 years. There is a plan from the University of Cambridge of how the world could reduce its homicide rate by 50% in the next 30 years, and that's quite a feasible goal. Other kinds of violent crime have also been in decline. The domestic violence, which is violence against wives and girlfriends, rape and sexual assault are down 75% since the records were first kept in the 1970s. Children are safer. They're safer from violent victimization at school, including bullying, and safer from physical abuse and sexual abuse by caregivers. In fact, we've been getting safer in just about every way. Thanks to advances in safety technology in cars like seatbelts and airbags, thanks to the design of better highways and more consistent enforcement of traffic laws, the chance of being killed in a car accident has fallen by 96% in the last century. We are 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire. Fire departments, by the way, are putting themselves out of business. 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. However, there is one category of accidental death that has gone the other way. That is the category called poison by solid or liquid. And here you see the results of the American opioid epidemic. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. And what about the acts of God? The droughts, floods, wildfires, storms, volcanoes, landslides, meteor strikes, earthquakes. Thanks to more resilient infrastructure, better early warning systems, and better emergency responses, we're 96% less likely to die in an act of God, presumably not because God has become more merciful. Indeed, think about the quintessential act of God, everyone's favorite metaphor for an unpredictable date with death, the literal bolt from the blue. Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. We are naturally illiterate, and even in early modern Europe, no more than 15% of the population could read and write. European countries achieved universal literacy by the mid-20th century. Germany a little bit later. Here you see Italy, the United States, Chile, and Mexico. Here you have the trajectory for the world as a whole, showing that today 80% of the world can read or write, and 90% of the world under the age of 25. Not just boys, but girls. In 1750, only 6 girls could read or write for every 10 boys, and that gender parity was achieved in the late 19th century. The world as a whole is very close to gender parity in literacy. Even the most backward parts of the world, Pakistan and Afghanistan, have shown dramatic increases, for which we can thank the other winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015, Malala Yousafzai. And in perhaps the most incredible example of progress of all, the one that defies belief, that people, their jaws drop, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented effect known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores all over the world have increased by 3 points per decade for a century. A gift of the spread of education, but also of the trickling down of abstract concepts and visual symbols from technical domains like science and technology to everyday experience. Well, have these gains improved our quality of life? In many ways they have. In 1870, the typical work week in the United States and Western Europe was greater than 62 years. That has fallen by 62 hours per week, that is. That's fallen by 22 hours a week, and in addition, most American workers get 3 weeks of paid vacation. Thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, and to the adoption of what used to be called labor-saving devices, like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our life that we lose to housework has fallen from 62 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. That is from about 8 hours a day to 2 hours a day. And when I say we, I really should say women, because housework is highly gendered. Given that housework is the activity that people rate as the least favorite way to spend their time, this itself is an enormous gain in quality of life. Thanks to shorter work weeks and less time lost to housework, leisure time has increased by about 8 hours a week. Just since 1965, the gain for women started to level off around 1995, and I was puzzled by this graph and read the fine print in the tables. And the reason for the leveling off is that women are spending more time with their children. So a single working mother today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s. So forget the stereotypes from Leave It to Beaver. Now is the time when women are spending more time with their children. We also forfeit less of our paycheck to necessities, from 60% a century ago to less than a third today. Has it made us any happier? It's often said that money can't buy happiness, but that's not exactly true. If you look at a graph of self-rated life satisfaction as a function of GDP per capita, on a logarithmic scale, you see there's actually a pretty strong relationship, both within across countries, as indicated by the scatter plot of points, and within countries, as indicated by the arrows impaling each point. Again, it's a logarithmic scale, which means the relationship starts to bend over when you get to higher income levels. But what this graph suggests is that as countries get richer, as all countries are doing, their citizens are likely to get happier. And indeed, the World Values Survey has found that in 45 of the 52 countries they have tracked, 86%, happiness has increased over the last 40 years. Has it come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is, it surely has, although that is starting to turn around. According to a report card given to countries called the Environmental Performance Index, 178 out of 180 countries have shown improvements in environmental quality over the last few decades. I'll just show you a snapshot of what's happened in the United States. Since 1970, thanks to the year of the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, thanks to legislation that regulates pollution and to pollution control technology, while the American population has increased by 40%, GDP has increased by a factor of 2.5. We've driven twice as many miles, but the 5 major air pollutants have been reduced by 60%. So the idea that is conventional wisdom, both on the extreme libertarian right and on the extreme green left, that we have to choose between economic growth and environmental protection, turns out to be false. Deforestation in temperate regions of the world has fallen to 0, as forests are no longer cleared for farms, and abandoned farms are, in fact, being recolonized by temperate forests. The situation is not as rosy when it comes to tropical forests, where there is still alarming deforestation, but the tide has turned, and the peak for deforestation was more than 40 years ago, and it has come down. Since 1970, the world has shipped twice as much oil by sea, but has had 85% fewer oil spills. And the amount of the Earth's surface that's protected against economic exploitation has doubled from 8% to 15%, while the amount of the world's oceans that are protected has also doubled from 6% to 12%. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having a sunny disposition, but is an empirical fact. And how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, I'm going to show you a graph that uses the technique of sentiment mapping that tallies the number of positive versus negative words in a sample of news stories, going back to 1945 when it comes to the New York Times. During this era of increasing peace, prosperity, and happiness, the New York Times has gotten glummer and glummer. And that is true of a summary of the world's broadcasts as well, which has become increasingly morose. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from cognitive psychology. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman have shown that the human brain tends to estimate risk and probability via a shortcut they call the availability heuristic. Namely, the more easily we can recall examples from memory, the more common we think an event is. People, for example, think that tornadoes kill more people every year than asthma attacks, whereas it's drastically the other way around, presumably because tornadoes make for great television and asthma attacks not so much. Indeed, if you combine the availability heuristic with the nature of news, recalling that news is about stuff that happens, not stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, here I am reporting live from a country that is not at war, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual changes. As the economist Max Roser points out, the news could have had run the headline, 138,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 25 years. But they never ran that headline. Leading to the hypothetical story in The Onion. CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. You combine the availability heuristic with the nature of the news, and you get the impression that the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. There's another feature of our psychology that predisposes us to pessimism about the world, called the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we anticipate gains. We dwell more on what can go wrong than what can go right. Especially recent bad events that in distant memory tend to lose their negative coloring. Explaining an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. The negativity bias also opens up a market for doomsayers and prophets to remind us of hazards we may have overlooked. As a result, pessimism often sounds serious. Optimism sounds frivolous. As Morgan Housel, a financial writer, pointed out, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. There's also a status competition among elites. Society is divided into different professional guilds and clubs with differing responsibilities for making the society run. To complain about modern society is a backhanded way of putting down your professional rivals. It's a way for academics to look down on business people, for business people to look down on politicians, for political challengers to look down on incumbents, and so on. This has been going on for quite some time, as Thomas Hobbes said in the 17th century. Competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead. Let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment. You might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to afflict the comfortable, to rake the muck, to speak truth to power? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we must be aware of problems and suffering and injustice where they occur, but it's also important to be aware of how they can be reduced. There are dangers to thoughtless pessimism, such as fatalism. Why throw good money after bad? Why throw money down a rat hole? The poor will always be with you. Why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Indeed, if we are doomed, as many prophets remind us, then we should just enjoy life while we can, since there's nothing that we can do to forestall that doom. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It can also open the door to radicalism. If every institution is in irrevocable decline, if the society is degenerating fast and on the verge of collapse, well, that opens up calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground under the expectation that anything rising out of the ashes has got to be better than what we have today, or to empower an aspiring demagogue who promises only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? Well, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would be magic, not progress. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems, and problems are inevitable. Solutions create new problems which have to be solved in their turn. Also, the world can always be blindsided by nasty surprises, and I've mentioned a number of them: the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, the American opioid epidemic. And there are severe global challenges that we have not solved, foremost among them being climate change and the risk of nuclear war. I think it is best to see these not as apocalypses in waiting, but as solvable but as yet unsolved problems. We can address climate change by attempts to decarbonize our economy via carbon pricing and low, zero, and negative carbon technologies, and to pursue denuclearization via international stability, which would make nuclear weapons unneeded, obsolete, anachronistic, and programs of arms reduction. Just a couple of hints that these are not vain utopian hopes is the fact that in some ways they have already begun. There's a natural arc in modern economies toward emitting less CO2 per dollar of GDP. Here we have a graph for the UK showing that as the UK underwent the Industrial Revolution, it emitted far more CO2 as large amounts of coal were burned to power the Industrial Revolution. But then there was a transition from coal to oil, from oil to natural gas, and then to renewables and nuclear energy and hydro, which has resulted in less CO2 being emitted per unit of wealth. The US underwent the same transition. China did, with huge spikes from the Maoist era, where people were forced to set up backyard smelters that emitted vast amounts of CO2 with zero economic output. But it has started to come down, as it has for India and the world as a whole. Now, I have to emphasize, this does not mean that the climate will have a soft landing. Those figures have to go down to zero, which is an extraordinary challenge, but it shows that economies are not inherently tied to flaming carbon. The major fact about nuclear weapons is that no nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki, more than 70 years ago, and there is something like a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, even at least so far, including tactical nuclear weapons. And there's been a massive reduction in the size of the world's arsenal, at least so far, an 85% reduction since the height of the Cold War in the 1980s. Indeed, about 10% of American electricity is generated from nuclear fuel from spent nuclear weapons, mainly Soviet. More generally, progress is not a mystical force, but it depends on embracing the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely applying reason and science to enhance human flourishing. If we continue to apply these principles, then progress could continue, and if we don't, it may not. Final question: does the Enlightenment go against human nature, as some romantics and defenders of religion insist? Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to satisfy human needs? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, it's not so clear. Secular liberal democracies turn out to be the happiest and healthiest places on earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even spiritual. This is a heroic story that is not just a myth, it is true, or true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. Also, it is a heroic story that doesn't belong to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient being with the power of reason and the drive to persist in its being. Because it depends only on the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you very much.
Okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
My first note says, remember to mention post-show book sales
Okay. Thank you.
out there. You haven't mentioned Trump except by sort of inference, but since he is mentioned in your book quite a lot, and you seem to be saying that one of the ways these various success curves can be reversed is the policies of the current administration. You want to spell that out a bit?
Yes. Well, I faced a challenge in writing a book on progress that came out in after 2016, shortly after 2016, because it doesn't look like so much progress. And I got conflicting advice. Some people said, oh, he's just a blip, progress is going to continue, you want your book to be relevant long after he's left the stage, don't mention him. Others said, well, you should, after every measure of progress that you document, you should say, but this is threatened if Donald Trump gets his way. So I didn't follow either bit of advice, but I did try to put the Trumpism in perspective in a couple of ways. One is, first of all, it is undoubtedly true that almost all of the measures that I attributed progress to are really under threat from Trump's policies. The international community of both of commercial connections through trade and strong international norms and associations like the UN, like the ability to impose sanctions to countries that violate the taboo against conquest are threatened. The regulations that have made technology safer, that have allowed environmental protection the environment to be protected as the economy has grown. A reliance on science and evidence, both as a way to extend the human lifespan, and to implement policies like crime reduction that are driven by evidence. I mean, I could go on. They really are threatened. It isn't just the standard liberals discussed with Donald Trump. I pinpoint why each one of these causes of progress really has been threatened. So the question is for one thing, does that mean that Trumpism and authoritarian populism more generally are the wave of the future? So was progress nice while it lasted, but the Enlightenment is over and the clock's going to be turned back? Well, I mean, no one knows. But there are some reasons to think not. That it's a little premature to declare the Enlightenment dead. Among them are that a lot of these processes are trends that have been in progress for decades, and it seems unlikely that they will suddenly do a U-turn, for what that's worth, including just the political and sentiments toward liberalism. One graph that I chose not to show tonight, it comes from the World Values Survey, and it looks at attitudes of tolerance, women's rights, democratic political participation, and in every region of the world, they've been going up since 1960. So that's more than 50 years. Big differences across regions, but with the Middle East and North Africa, the world's least liberal region, and Western Europe most, but there has been a steady increase in every region of the world. This is driven by urbanization, by education, by connectivity, forces that are themselves not likely to stop overnight. Also, if you look at the age distribution of support for populism, I have a graph that shows the degree of support for Donald Trump in 2016, Brexit in 2016, and European populist parties over the last 15 years, and they all kind of fall off a cliff as a function of age. Now, people, contrary to the old cliche that if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you are a liberal when you're 60, you have no head, attributed to many people. That turns out to be false. People basically carry their liberalism with them as they age, which suggests that populism is something of a middle-aged and old man's movement, and the demographics are likely to push against it.
So a related demographic question is immigration is a big event, especially in Europe and North America. Are immigrants more liberal or what?
It depends a lot on the immigrants, and in fact, some of the rise of populism is due not to, I think, a retreat from Enlightenment values, but to the specific incident of huge waves of immigration from parts of the world that are the least liberal, Middle East and North Africa, often not assimilating quickly and bringing a lot of counter-Enlightenment values with them, such as religious fundamentalism and oppression of women. And there has been a backlash against that massive immigration that has empowered some of the right-wing populists in Europe. The other thing I do in dealing with populism and Trumpism is to note that this is actually not the first time that Enlightenment values have been resisted, even though it sounds like an oxymoron to talk about the intellectual roots of Trumpism. And at first I thought that Trumpism was just kind of pure id, just streaks of human nature of authoritarianism, tribalism, demonization that always push back against Enlightenment. And I think there is something to that. I think the Enlightenment is not so cognitively natural. Tribalism really is a recurring motive. But there actually is, Trump was advised by people like Steve Bannon, Michael Anton, Steve Miller, who consider themselves intellectuals. They are consider themselves well-read, and they were influenced by counter-Enlightenment political thinkers and philosophers, by crackpot French and Italian fascists from the 1910s and the 1920s, from Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a rabidly counter-Enlightenment figure, and pretty soon after the Enlightenment unfolded, there was a resistance movement, kind of romantic counter-Enlightenment, nationalist, tribalist, blood and soil, devaluing the individual in favor of the culture, the tribe, the land, the bloodline. And it gained ascendance in various times of European history, especially in Central Europe around the time of World War I and World War II. It was in abeyance after World War II, because the world sort of saw what it leads to. But it does tend to bubble up, and that's what we've been seeing, I think, with authoritarian populism.
A couple questions about the research that what we just saw reflects. Craig asks, how do you perform your research to ensure the statistics you use aren't affected by an implicit bias toward data that shows positive progress? And I would add to that, I can't believe you did all this research. So say a little bit about how you accumulated the material that's behind these graphs, which is the real meat of what you have here.
From various places, I was assisted greatly by a couple of new websites that have popped up that are kind of data aggregators. Max Roser's website, Our World in Data, stupendous source of data, because not only are there graphs, but you can download them and link to the original source of each one. Often United Nations organizations, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Bank. There's another one by Marian Tupy called humanprogress.org. There's Hans and Ola Rosling's website, Gapminder. So that was a kind of portal into some of the standard data sets. And others I found from various sources by, often if I read a large number of books by experts in the particular domains and would go to their references and follow up on their data sets. And I don't think any of the sources that I cite are particularly controversial in terms of their direction. That is, you could quibble about exact values, but I would be surprised if any of them were not the consensus of the academic experts in each field. So I think it's pretty well established among historical criminologists, for example, that there's been a massive reduction in homicide since the Middle Ages.
So
I think all the
Craig's question is sort of how do you defeat your own confirmation bias?
Well, if by looking at curves that go in the wrong direction, like the opioid epidemic, like the great American crime boom, well, not just American, Western crime boom in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if that graph stayed high, that would be a counterexample to progress in that domain. If the graph for deaths in wars was World War I, and then World War II, and then World War III, that would be a disconfirmation. So anything could be disconfirmed. That's easy. The fact is the graphs do go down like that.
I should think actually, if I were you, I'd be welcoming anything that is sort of counter to these trends because they're so continuous and wide and gross and so on. That, anything that goes against it, you sort of need it in order to add some kind of plausibility to your story.
Well, no, that's true. And another example for those who are kind of eagle-eyed, very, very quick graph spotters may have seen a number of reversals, such as the fact that the American homicide rate, which fell pretty steadily from 1992 to 2014, went up in 2015 and 2016. I mean, didn't undo the decline, but wiped out about 9 years of progress. And the Syrian civil war represents a reversal. The peak was probably the year before last, let's hope. But that was went in the wrong direction. In fact, in the book, I have, for the graphs for violence, I put a little arrow pointing to the last year of data plotted in my previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, to address the question, well, did you maybe catch the world at a lucky moment, and has it all fallen apart since then? And in a couple of cases, like the uptick in American homicide, it has gone in the other direction. The Syrian civil war, again, was a blip up from the low from 2010. So the graphs could go any which way. And you're right, it would be, if they all just went monotonically downward, then you would mistrust things.
Positively creepy. Kai, from the United Nations Innovation Lab, asks, where does female empowerment and leadership fit into this new era of enlightenment?
Yeah, it's actually a theme that I explored more in The Better Angels of Our Nature than in this book. Just the question that people often ask about violence is, as women are more empowered, would you expect rates of violence to go down? And the answer is probably yes. And in the broader case of human flourishing, I didn't comment on this, but it does seem that there is in the switch from, say, martial values, tribalism, national glory, to humanism, you could say this is a kind of feminization of morality, that a world in which it's safe to bring up children who grow up, who get an education, who don't die of disease, who don't starve to death, as opposed to the glory of the nation. You could say that that's a shift from kind of prototypically masculine to more feminine values. And it may not be a coincidence that many of these changes have been coincident with the rising empowerment of women since the 1970s.
How's that going in your world of academia, which is famously slow to feminize?
Well, it's actually it hasn't been slow to feminize. I mean, there are some.
They're in the students, but how about in the power structure?
Well, it depends on the discipline. I come from
say more.
I'm a psychologist. Our discipline is doing pretty well for gender parity. In fact, my main area of specialization was language development in children, which was majority female. Psychology is one of the more closer to gender parity, not exactly. And it's depending on the discipline, there's enormous differences in the percentage of scientists who are female.
Okay. Here's a live stream question from my friend Hugh Howey. Live stream, I recommend to folks. I've just started trying it myself, and on live stream, you see the slides better than you see it in the theater. And questions come to the stage. So Hugh Howey asks, how does the balance of knowledge that things are getting better and passion required to continue the trends blend? How do we manage to make it easier for people to be rational pessimists and optimistic activists?
Rational pessimists and optimistic
the people
activists.
sort of sit back and say things are going to be okay. Whew, I'm going to go golf.
Yeah. I don't know if that's happened. In fact, I'm planning to do experiments with a student of mine, Jason Nemero, to see whether narratives of decline and degeneration or narratives of conditional progress are more likely to empower people to donate effectively to charity, to not to discount the future as much. So we don't know for sure. My hunch is that there is an optimal amount of pessimism and that many people are more pessimistic than the optimum. And I don't know if this is true. It's an empirical question. I just know, so you should never do this, but of course we all do, just from my own experience. I feel I've been more of a donor to charities, more of an activist, more spoken out more, since I've seen all of the ways in which humanity has increased. It's human activity can pay off in things actually getting better. It's not just feeling good, it's not just conspicuous virtue signaling, but trying to make the world better makes the world better. And I appreciate that more.
Have you yourself, over the course of these last couple of kinds of research books, shifted your own personal relationship to the world from a less pessimistic to a more optimistic?
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a paper trail, because in 2002, I wrote a book called The Blank Slate on the Modern Denial of Human Nature. And a belief in human nature has tended to militate toward a kind of tragic view of the human condition. We're not angels, we can never have a utopia. On the other hand, as a cognitive psychologist, my view of human nature always accommodated a system of our brain that can creatively combine new ideas. As someone who studies language, I know that we can share our hard-won wisdom through words. And so there is scope for human improvement, even with a belief in human nature. Namely, we come up with new ideas, we try them, we share them, we keep the ones that work. But I think between writing The Blank Slate, Defending Human Nature, and The Better Angels of Our Nature, which was inspired by stumbling across graphs showing declines in violence, I've become more optimistic based on the data and more, and I think more engaged in effective altruism and advocacy of positive change.
Well, effectiveness is an interesting measure. If you looked at activists across the board and we're sort of evaluating their effectiveness as activists in the domain that they care about, and then measured their effectiveness as activists in that domain against their pessimism or optimism, is anybody looking to see what makes an effective activist, and is this part of that story?
That I would love to know the answer. So I suspect that that effective activists do have at least enough optimism, enough animal spirits, as Keynes put it, to take the risks under uncertainty, to make the personal sacrifices under some reasonable expectation that they'll return benefits to human welfare. Again, this is speculation. I think it's something that should be studied.
I have a question in the language here. You're this language guy. We call it optimism and pessimism, and one is an optimist or pessimist. It's sort of like a communist and communism. Is this a belief structure we're talking about, or what?
Yes. Well, this goes back to a belief in human nature. I'm virtually certain that a big chunk of differences among people in level of optimism versus pessimism is heritable, just because everything is partly heritable. And there are certain personality traits that would tend to correlate with optimism, pessimism that we know are heritable, such as neuroticism, which is a degree of worry and anxiety.
Correlate. So who's more neurotic?
Oh, the pessimists. Yeah, absolutely. But optimism, the term optimism, I think it actually does go back to the era of Leibniz and Voltaire. And an optimist was someone who believed that this is the best of all possible worlds, namely, this is the optimum. And ironically enough, Voltaire was actually not satirizing what
I never got that. Optimism
is optimal.
And optimum, duh.
Yes, which actually is not the way we use the word now, because as I mentioned, if you're really an optimist, you don't think that this is the optimum. Heaven forbid.
So what is
I don't know
What's the root
where
of
pessimism comes
okay,
from.
we'll find out.
But in any case, Voltaire wasn't even satirizing hopes for a better future. I mean, he was an Enlightenment figure. He was satirizing almost the opposite, Leibniz's theodicy, according to which we have no choice but to accept the evil and violence and suffering and early death in the world because it's metaphysically impossible for the world to be any better than it is. Because if it could be better, God would have made it better. So what we have, we're stuck with. It's impossible for the world to be better. That's what Leibniz had in mind, and that's what Voltaire was satirizing.
Speaking of that, there's a
Pangloss,
question
sorry.
from a person named Anonymous who says, is there a religious component from monotheism which helped or be considered helping modern enlightenment in science and quality of life, or not?
Well, certainly the Enlightenment thinkers themselves were, even though many of them were not atheists, some of them were deists. They believed that God kind of wound up the clock of the universe, set it in motion, and then let it kind of unwind by itself without any intervention. None of them really appealed to Judeo-Christian doctrine to justify much of anything. So in fact, often the Enlightenment is almost defined as a abandonment of justification by scripture, dogma, tradition. There is a notion of progress among religious thinkers that may have influenced the Enlightenment, the idea that there has been progress from, at least among Christian thinkers, from the ancient Hebrews to Jesus, to the early church, if you're Protestant, to the Reformation. So there is that notion, that at least concept of progress. But it's...
Well, these churches were an institution. Are they an institution in the Enlightenment sense that you've been talking about as a sort of an ameliorator of a lot of the fragmented, feudal-like killing and all the rest of it?
Well, some of them, especially the Catholic Church, fought the Enlightenment tooth and nail. Joseph de Maistre, for example, was argued against the abolition of torture and grisly torture executions because people will just run wild with licentiousness if they don't have the fear of being tortured to death. He was against reading of novels because then people would start to get ideas about nonconformity. So certainly the Catholic Church was dead set again, and actually in many ways continues to be. And that many of our, much of what you might think of as sort of strange opposition to Enlightenment, including some of the negative reviews of Enlightenment now, come from prominent intellectuals who would be the first to note that they are influenced by Catholicism, such as Andrew Sullivan, such as Ross Douthat. And there's been a queasiness among many Catholic thinkers to Steve Bannon, another Catholic thinker, to the idea that and again, he makes no bones about it. He addressed the Vatican, and one of his most famous speeches was delivered there. The idea that the individual human is both the locus of moral valuation, that what's important is how happy each one of us is, that human reason is the source of moral doctrine as opposed to something that is bigger than any of us, namely the church and the church tradition, that the freedom and individual self-determination have just led to licentiousness, to pornography and abortion and divorce. So there has been a tension between Enlightenment and at least some religious traditions. Others, though, have been influenced by the Enlightenment, and many religious denominations have become more humanistic, more liberal. Quakerism was in some ways ahead of the curve because they were both abolitionists and pacifists in an era where not all Enlightenment thinkers were, and certainly most other religious denominations were not. And other denominations, mainstream Protestantism, the more liberal branches of Judaism, have, I think, been affected by the Enlightenment tide and have backtracked from the Iron Age morality, from the theological doctrines, and have become kind of institutions of humanism themselves.
You're among the sort of public, somewhat aggressive atheists. Is that correct to
I
say?
don't think I'm aggressive. I mean, I'm clear. I mean, I have the statement. There's no evidence that God exists, and I think that's a true statement. I don't think it's aggressive. It's perceived as aggressive. I think precisely because it is only by faith, tribe, community, bloodline that you have beliefs, almost by definition, that are based on faith. And so, if you simply put those beliefs under a rational microscope, it sounds like you're attacking the people who acquired those beliefs because of the community that they were born into. So that's where I think the perception of aggression comes from, even though it's just a hypothesis. And why can't I say there's no evidence if there's no evidence?
So how's atheism doing on one of your charts? Is it up, down?
Well, there are two different trends. By the way, and I have to quote here Bertrand Russell, who's when he was challenged by some vicar on the BBC, like, what will you say if after you die you find yourself staring the Almighty in the face? And he said, "Oh Lord, why did you not give me more evidence?" But back to your question.
And the Lord says, what part of the word faith do you not understand?
That'd be another way of putting it. So there are two trends that are going in opposite directions. One of them is that when people shift their religious belief, it is in the direction of losing their religion. The fastest growing religion in terms of converts is no religion at all. However, religious people have more babies. So the number of people that are in communities of faith is increasing, even though the number of people who become religious is decreasing. The other trend that makes us overestimate the influence of religion, why many people believe that despite Enlightenment hopes, people are getting, that religion is playing a larger and larger role, aside from just sheer fecundity, which itself may change in the future because a lot of the trends that have reduced religiosity, like urbanization, like education, like affluence, as those continue, they also affect fertility. And so it could be that the trend toward the demographic transition to lower fertility may also involve secularization. But the other, I think, distorter of our perception of the role of religion is that religious people vote. And a lot of secular people do not.
Why do religious people vote?
Partly their clergy tell them to. It may also be, that may be one reason. And so, in fact, in the 2016 election, I think the voting rate among evangelical Christians was in the ballpark of 80%. The voting rate among so-called nuns, N-O-N-E, not related to hats, not nuns, was more like 25%. Now, partly this is age. There's a pretty big cohort effect for religiosity. The younger the group, the less religious. But it may also be that whatever social, cultural, personality type allows you to affiliate with any institution makes you more engaged in the political process, and that some of the nuns aren't so much kind of students of Bertrand Russell who've figured it all out, but they just kind of withdraw from all institutions, from churches, but also from the political process.
Okay. Here's the internet question, social media question. Justin asks, how do you feel about communication over the internet has affected our ability to have discourses and advancement? And where does it fit into this story, do you think?
Yeah, so that's the, so nowadays, everything that goes wrong is blamed on social media.
Right.
And, maybe some of the things that have gone wrong are a fault of social media, and some surely are. I don't really know I think it's too, and by that I mean, who cares what I know? But I think it is not known in the sense that it's so new that I don't think there's a good body of literature on how much social media has driven the polarization that we have seen. A lot of it has been driven by cable news, and there we do know that it has an effect, just by the natural experiment that cable companies offer different menus of stations, And Fox News in particular is sometimes introduced to one town before it's introduced to another town. And so for social scientists, it's, yes, an independent variable, an experiment of nature. And what happens is there is absolutely an effect of Fox News on voting and political opinions. When Fox News is introduced to a town, the citizens move to the right. And so that's not social media, but that is an effect. There's also a big effect, and again, I don't know if we have the social science data to disentangle them, but segregation by education, and that more highly educated people tend to live with one another more. There are patterns across urban areas versus suburbs. And here I am saying this in San Francisco. It's kind of bloody obvious. And that the like-minded communities may be driven by physical proximity and by occupational segregation, as far as, as much as by social media filter bubbles.
There's a couple of where should we go from here questions. Alexander Rose asks, what trends or data give you the most concern? And Emily asks, where should we focus our efforts for progress in the future, in your opinion?
Yeah.
And those may be separate questions. They may be related.
They might be related, yeah.
Where should we focus?
Well, certainly in terms of actual physical threats, I'm concerned about climate change. I assume you are too, but maybe not as much as me, or more, but.
Well, I don't know how much you are, so
I'll take you off the hook. I'm concerned about climate change. I am concerned about the low probability, high damage scenario of a nuclear war.
Interesting still, okay.
Not because I think it's particularly likely, but just because it's, if it does happen, it can be, a lot of people can be killed very quickly. In the world of ideas, I am concerned about the rise of authoritarian populism. As I said, I think there are demographic and trends that are probably will prevent it from taking over, but in the meantime, it certainly has gained control of a number of countries. I'm concerned about impediments to economic growth. If there are structural brakes on growth, like debt, like an expanding retired population supported by a shrinking working population.
Japan, we're talking about now.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that surprised me as I wrote the book is how many good things come from economic growth. I mentioned happiness as one, but the Flynn effect of rising IQ scores is affected by how wealthy a country is. Liberal values, richer countries in general are more tolerant, more progressive, more liberal, at least if the source of their wealth comes from knowledge and commerce as opposed to digging stuff out of the ground. Because there are a number of extraction states, particularly in the Middle East, Arab oil states, that are very rich and very reactionary. But putting aside them, in general, wealth buys liberalism, it buys intelligence, it buys happiness, it buys peace, it buys democracy, on average. So if economic growth were to plateau, then there'd be a lot of negative consequences. So that's something I think about.
So one question, Enlightenment now, New Enlightenment, that was then, this is now. You're talking about the values which were established then and that are still valid to push forward. What's different? 200 years is a long time. A whole hell of a lot has gone on. And that we're still even evoking something that was basically invented over 200 years ago is itself strange and amazing, but okay, we'll go with that. What is an enlightenment now made of? Are we just seeing this is the enlightenment playing out quietly behind the scenes, making all these graphs go forward? Is there something extra special that these questions are raising that we might be doing now so that we are the Voltaires and Diderots and so on of our time? What are we talking about now in terms of enlightenment?
Well, now we certainly are talking about limiting the resurgence of tribalism, nationalism, racialism. I think that in general, although I don't think that religion is necessarily incompatible with Enlightenment values because religions become more enlightened. But certainly fundamentalist beliefs, getting your morality from Scripture, getting your theory of causation from Scriptures, so using prayer or faith as a solution to problems, I think is highly problematic. I'll be concrete. There is a belief, there's a huge correlation between utter denial of human-made climate change and both right-left politics, much greater correlation than scientific literacy. In fact, the correlation with scientific literacy is probably zero. The correlation with where you are on the right-left scale is very, very high, 0.8 or something, or 0.9. And there is a correlation with religiosity. So there was a movement in the 1990s and first few years of the 21st century toward sometimes called stewardship of the environment, kind of confluence of the religious with the environmental movement. I think it was called creation environmentalism. It went by a number of names. It was completely dashed when Obama became president and the Republican Party vowed a principle of absolute non-cooperation with anything the Obama administration proposed. And of course, evangelical Christians were locked up by the Republican Party. And so the dream, E.O. Wilson had a whole book where he had a letter to a hypothetical minister of how they could find common cause in protecting God's gift of the environment. Forget about it. There was just, the evangelicals became implacably opposed to any measures to address carbon emissions or environmental protection. And part of it was polls show that a large percentage of them believe God wouldn't let any bad thing happen. God wouldn't let there be climate catastrophes. So this is a case in which a counter-enlightenment belief could have real pernicious consequences.
Okay, and so in a sense, you're using concern about climate as a sort of measure of enlightenment actually in people, in the enlightened ones who are paying attention.
That would be one example.
But it also sounds like, since you're talking the outliers of this political spectrum, that if there were less outliers and more folks sort of arguing agreeably with each other, rather than totally not listening, that somehow would move in the right direction.
I would.
So hard right and hard left are both problems?
I think so. Yeah. Just from research that shows that when people are committed to a political ideology, they are demonstrably less rational. This has been shown by in a number of ways by Philip Tetlock, who has spoken in this series, who's shown that if you look at how accurately people predict the future, I mean, not kind of seeing into the next century, but just hold their feet to the fire, make concrete predictions about what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. The political ideologues do much worse than the kind of the Bayesian nerds, the ones who try to assess a base rate probability and tweak it up or down by the evidence. And another example is the work of the Yale legal scholar Daniel Kahan, who did a famous experiment. It was reported in a number of newspapers as why politics makes us stupid, or politics interferes with your ability to do math, that presenting data to people from a hypothetical study, where the data were jiggered so that there was a kind of gut feeling as to what they implied, whether A caused B, that was wrong. That is, if you looked at the raw numbers, it would seem that A caused B, but if you take a second and just do the proportions, then you realize it's the other way around. So it's deliberately a little bit of a trick question, so it required a bit of reflection. If it's a non-political issue, does this skin cream successfully treat a rash? Then the more numerate you are, the less likely you are to be seduced by the wrong answer, both if you're a liberal or a conservative. But as soon as the issue becomes politicized, namely, does a concealed carry law increase or reduce the crime rate? Same numbers. Then it turns out that the more numerate liberals and conservatives did worse when the data went against their preferred hypothesis. And so politics makes us stupid. And that's the basis of my expectation that less polarization would lead to more optimal policies.
And how's that playing out in academia? I know you've inveighed a bit
Yes.
against over-politicization of who can speak on campus and so on.
I think it has distorted certain issues in academia. That was one theme of my book, The Blank Slate, that a lot of issues in psychology, I think, had been distorted by the fact that certain answers were deemed politically more acceptable, and there was a kind of blinkers toward data that contradicted it. That was a theme that was then taken up by Phil Tetlock again and John Haidt and Jose
You
Duarte.
guys are sort of group of what are seen as conservative public intellectual academics.
Well, conservative in the sense, from the perspective of what I
Not
call...
insanely liberal? What are we talking about?
Well, I refer to the hypothetical location called the left pole. So when you're at the North Pole, all directions are south. When you're at the left pole, all directions are right.
Okay.
So from the left pole in academia, by that standard, it might be called a conservative, but I'm a very peculiar conservative. I'm one of the biggest donors among the Harvard faculty to the Democratic Party. I voted for Hillary. I'm really by no stretch of the imagination a conservative, except by this peculiar perspective of the left pole.
Is that getting better on campus or worse, by the way?
It's getting worse. The point of the Tetlock, Haidt, Duarte, Stern article was that the kind of diversity that really advances intellectual understanding and policy is diversity of viewpoint. And that has been decreasing even in an era in which diversity is celebrated. As the civil liberties lawyer Harvey Silverglate put it, in modern universities, the meaning of diversity is people who look different but think alike. So what the Heterodox Academy, which I'm affiliated with, and John Haidt and others have advocated, is science will advance if we have a diversity of viewpoints, simply because no one is omniscient, no one is infallible. Science progresses when hypotheses are floated, the incorrect ones are refuted by data. And if we only try hypotheses from a narrow slice of the spectrum of possibilities, we're probably going to be wrong a lot of the time.
Okay. I think I'll end with a nice general question from Neil Goldberg. How do you relate contemporary China, which has made huge progress along all these measures, and you would not exactly describe it as an Enlightenment society? So what's going on?
No, it's a question. I don't know the answer, but it is I think it is a profound question. Certainly, China, as repressive as it is, and even more so with the announcement a few days ago of the removal of term limits for Xi Jinping, it's certainly more has greater degree of personal freedom than it did in the era of Mao, and some Enlightenment institutions like markets were adopted by China to its enormous benefit in terms of prosperity, lifespan, and so on.
You could say partly they were adopting what Lee Kuan Yew had done in Singapore. Now, was that an Enlightenment phenomenon that Lee did there?
In one way, yes, and in other ways, no. So yes, in terms of markets, which was an Enlightenment innovation compared to royal charters and mercantilism and beggar thy neighbor policies. So openness to trade and to private enterprise was certainly an Enlightenment institution, but of course not democracy, which is another Enlightenment brainchild that was not adopted. So it's kind of a hybrid of Enlightenment and authoritarian institutions.
How's this all look, really final question, going forward 100, 200 years? That's the frame that talking about the Enlightenment sort of raises. Here's this set of ideas, set of practices, set of even traditions that have been around for a couple of centuries. Do they own the next couple of centuries? And if that's the case, are we basically just looking at this trend line continuing, or what? What do you see in the longer time frame here? What's the long now of this whole question?
Yes, well, I might cop out by citing Phil Tetlock, who's spoken in this series, who found that even his super forecasters, the best of the best predictors, felt a chance 5 years out. So I don't know. I guess the best I could say is that it's possible that it will continue. I mean, there are huge challenges, climate being one of them, energy, avoidance of the tail risks like nuclear war. But on the other hand, the process once set in motion does, barring these potential catastrophes, have the potential to improve indefinitely, even though if it'll never bring us to utopia because of human nature, crooked timber of humanity and all that stuff, because solutions generate new problems which constantly have to be solved in their turn. But still, barring the unlikely but catastrophic events, I think it's possible that the progress will continue for centuries.
So let me leave you with a research question for, I don't know if it's your next book, but whatever. And that is this: is long-term thinking actually useful or worth anything, or anything other than amusing?
Yeah.
Is there, if you look back in Enlightenment thinkers, were they long-term thinkers? The founding fathers of the U.S. sort of were, because they were actually sort of creating a society, a nation, and so they were talking, and the Constitution reflected their ideas of what should be applicable for generations. So at least that set, you could probably say long-term thinking was good for them. But across the board, it would be interesting to tease out, in the way that you've teased out how the Enlightenment values have played out and might play out, is there any goddamn value to long-term thinking?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, but long-term thinking, I assume we both agree, this doesn't mean kind of being a seer and prognosticating what will happen, but rather
Engaging.
Maybe?
Just taking responsibility for, rather than trying to control the long-term.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's actually essential to just clarify our thinking, even if it isn't making confident prognostications, but as a set of what-if scenarios. Absolutely. For the same reason that I don't think you can do history without thinking of counterfactuals. What would have happened if? Just because the notion of cause and effect is inherently tied to counterfactuals of the past and also of the future. So I think it's tremendously valuable if it's not confused with prophecy, but it isn't prophecy. It's long-term thinking.
Well, we got Neil Ferguson, who does counterfactuals, among other things, as an historian, speaking in the fall, so I'll ask him the same question. Thank you for doing this.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Thanks very much. Thank you.